Alright, Master Gardener trainees, let's start with cold protection part 2. This is where we talk about how to do this um, covering and protecting of plants properly. Covering of plants. There is a method to the madness. The cover should always be supported by a framework of stakes, ideally. You want to keep the cover from touching any part of the plant. Why is this important? Because wherever the cover touches the foliage of your desirable vegetation that's cold sensitive, there's a direct transfer of the cold to the plant tissue, and then it can freeze or burn wherever the cover has touched the plant. Good example of this is if you remember the days gone by from being up north or having visited up north, are people with single pane windows. If you held your hand a few inches away from the window, you might feel the coolness of the glass, but you didn't have a direct transfer of the cold to your hand. But if you put your hand directly on the glass, you could immediately feel the cold penetrating to your hand, and your hand would get pretty cold very, very rapidly. So keeping it off the foliage is important. Again, wherever it touches, you will see that is burned. Now, when I say burned, it really isn't being burned so much as it's dehydrating and gives a burned look. If very cold temperatures are forecast, you may need a heat source out there to protect some of these more cold sensitive plants. Covers only work for several degrees below the freezing point. Now, the idea is to keep the plant from freezing. We're not trying to make it like Gilligan's Island under that cover in 75-degree balmy weather. And also, don't get creative out there, folks. Let me tell you a real life story that happened many, many years ago while I was in Hernando County as a new agent. I had a gentleman that had a citrus tree, and he was worried about upcoming cold that we had, and he decided to cover it, and he put a electric space heater out in his yard. This is a true story. I do not make these up. And I said, "Oh, what time did the tree go up in smoke?" And he said, "Well, funny you should say that. He said he woke up about 3 in the morning to see that the cover had caught on fire and his tree had burned down." So, we don't need to be putting out space heaters in our yards, folks. A light bulb that throws heat is all that you need. So, keep that in mind. If you decide to use a heat source like a light bulb, make sure it is an incandescent that throws heat. These new LED bulbs throw virtually none. Also, make sure that the light bulb doesn't touch the cover. Otherwise, the cover may also get set on fire, and then you're going to have a big problem. Also, make sure that the light bulb, the thing that you screw the light bulb into, and the cord, etc., is all designed for outdoor use. If you take a regular old indoor light bulb and put it outside and moisture should hit it, it'll probably explode or pop, possibly causing a fire. Here is a small, I'll guess that's a lime bush. I don't know where this photograph was taken. I did steal it off the internet a few years ago. But people want lime trees. If you remember, first part of the module that I mentioned, that lemons and limes are tropical. So if it's going below freezing into the middle 20s or lower, you're going to need a heat source to protect that very tropical lime tree. So the person has created a wire cage around his or her prized lime tree and has employed some nice large old-fashioned Christmas tree bulbs. Notice that they're near the bottom. Again, heat rises, so you want it near the bottom of the plant. It also appears that they have a couple of jugs filled with water, maybe as a thermal mass, but I'm not quite sure. Although there is a thermometer in the middle of the picture, you just can't read the temperature, but again, it's above the freezing mark. And then there's a cover to trap the heat of those light bulbs to protect this particular little lime tree or shrub. I saw this several years ago somewhere online, and I thought I'd just put this in here. I don't expect you to remember the unit values whatsoever, but there are all sorts of styles of Christmas tree bulbs, usually the C9 and C7s. Now, the new fashion C9s and 7s, the LED versions, you can see each one uses very little wattage, either just a little over half a watt to 1 watt each bulb. Compare that with the ones that a lot of us grew up with. I had my grandfather's old set growing up when I was a kid. They probably each sucked down 10 watts of electricity, those bulbs. So they threw a lot of heat, those old-fashioned C9 bulbs. And as a result, they're the ones you want to seek out for using for cold protection. This is a great time to go online and find it everything online at an auction site. In trials conducted in Colorado State University, 125 light string of C7 mid-size Christmas lights per frame unit, 4 feet wide by 5 feet long, gave 6 degrees Fahrenheit heat, additional heat to what was an 18-degree outside air temperature. Now, if you're doing the math in your head, that's still not above the freezing point. So even with these large bulbs, it's still very hard to get enough heat, especially under a very thin cover like you can see in the photograph. You might want to use something with a thicker cover like a blanket that would have more insulative value. But again, this is one technique to throw additional heat under that cover. Here you can see somebody bought a already pre-made, I'm not sure what that's for, if that's supposed to be a little mini greenhouse or a place to store clothing or what. Look around and go to those farm and feed stores and online shopping and see if you can find something that pops up. Maybe that's even a barbecue grill cover for all I know. But again, you can see the light bulbs are near the bottom so that the heat will radiate up through, and it's the heat of those bulbs that is being trapped by the cover. The cover really is the secret to the protection. It is trapping the heat from the light bulbs or the heat of the earth if you don't use light bulbs. So again, it's that cover being extended all the way to the ground that is the secret. And people have made all sorts of homemade versions of it for various plants, and you can see in the upper left-hand photograph they use some heavy-duty stakes. I'm not sure what they're trying to grow. It looks like maybe a citrus tree, probably further north like Georgia or something, and they have an incandescent light bulb. And you can see the cover on the upper right-hand photograph being kind of translucent. These covers could be left in place for several days if need be. I generally don't recommend more than a few at a time, but again, if need be, especially if it's going to be still below the freezing point when you get up and have to leave for work or do something else, don't remove the cover at that point. Leave it on. It's much better. And here you can see at night they give quite an interesting glow in your neighborhood. And there are various things you can do to keep the covers off of plants. And here's a guy, not sure what he used, whether that's boards, a ladder would work, but he's covered the plant. And notice the cover goes up and over whatever plant that is and extends all the way to the ground. Also notice how he has it flared near the base, kind of like a teepee. The wider the area underneath the cover for heat to radiate off of the earth, the better. So what is happening is that cover being up and over with it as best you can, keeping it away from the foliage. It is that heat radiating off of the earth that is being trapped by the cover. Now the covers don't have to necessarily be very heavy. They can be fairly lightweight to be pretty effective. But again, you'll have to weight down the edges or the base of the cover so they don't blow over. I like the right-hand photograph. Somebody got creative, a way to keep plants all together and under a cover and keep the cover off of the foliage. It was to use their large outdoor patio umbrella, probably the table as well. So they have a couple of levels of places to put plants. Pretty inventive, I thought. This is what I commonly see while driving around, you know, either Pasco or Hernando County or Central Florida. Somebody has a cold sensitive plant, whether it's a palm or what under there. It's not a palm, it's a dicot, but you get what I'm saying. They wrap it like a lollipop. I see this time and time again. This cover gives little to no protection whatsoever to whatever desirable plant is wrapped inside, because you essentially cut off the heat from the earth to the foliage. So this plant will probably suffer an awful lot of damage for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's no heat being trapped underneath that cover. Also, notice how they've wrapped it. They pretty much have a lot of leaves touching the, the, the cover itself. So this plant will look pretty bad probably in about 24 hours after this photograph was taken of it. Now, can you use plastic? I get that question time and time again. I generally recommend against it, but if that's all you have and you had nothing else to protect the plant, it's better than no cover. But plastic has to be kept off of the foliage of the plant for sure, because wherever it touches, it's going to cause the tissue to freeze or burn or cook, however you want to call it. Now here you can see somebody is trying to grow a palm, parenthetically tree, out of its normal range. So they've constructed essentially a mini greenhouse to keep it in there with pipe and whatnot to keep it off the foliage. A lot of us gardeners like to push zones. I've seen palms as far north as Philadelphia. A friend of mine does something very similar to this photograph to protect his. Again, what we do for our plants sometimes. The problem with plastic, especially clear plastic in a small volume like that, is during the day these essentially become a very hot greenhouse, kind of like your car windows rolled up even though it's cold. It can be nice and toasty warm in your car. Even when you lived up north, you probably angled your windshield into the sunlight so it'd be nice and toasty when you got in after the end of a day or going shopping or something. So a lot of times you have to vent these to keep the plant materials from cooking during the daytime. Plant covers. Again, I said they can be made out of very light material. The material you see in the upper and the lower photographs is what is called frost cloth. Now, frost cloth is not a magical product. Although people hear the term frost cloth and think it somehow must be far superior to some other kind of fabric. What frost cloth really is, in the lower picture, I think you can see it better, is a non-woven material, kind of like handy wipes or those Clorox cleanup wipes or those wipes that pop up for quick cleanup. They're not they're not woven together like fabric per se. It's a spun material. That's really all it is. Now, what frost cloth has to its advantage is it's usually white in color, so it allows some amount of light to get through it. Also, frost cloth can be had in various lengths. You can buy big, large rolls if you wish and have them shipped to your house. Everything is now, Amazon Prime, etc. And you can get it in 100-foot rolls or even much larger rolls than that. When in Hernando, we bought a 1,000-foot roll and we would sell it to master gardeners and the public. You can also get frost cloth in various widths, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet, etc., etc., because it's used very commonly in agriculture. Now, if you're like me and rather than buying big rolls and spending, kind of a bit of money, if you're at the fabric shop and you see remnant pieces of fabric on a bolt and it's not too hideous, buy it. It's essentially the same thing. If you are like me, you go to the thrift shops and you buy blankets and sheets in the dead of summer when people aren't thinking about cold protection. And let me tell you, blankets are dirt cheap in July. People aren't thinking about this. I prefer blankets over sheets personally because they have a bit of weight. Not that they add that much insulation, a little extra maybe, but they don't blow around as much as sheets typically do or frost cloth. Now, if you are one of those people that can sew, stitch together several old bed sheets if you know how to do it. If you're like me and can't sew to save your life, those clip-style clothespins and can make a very simple way of connecting several sheets together to make one large cover. Now, remember, in order for the cover to work, it must go up and over the foliage, keeping the cover from touching the foliage, like you can see in the lower photograph and must extend all the way to the ground. Now you're going to have to use some kind of weight around the edges of your cover to weight it down. Whether it's bricks, logs, soil, whatever, a garbage can, it doesn't really matter. Old tablecloths can be used, sheets, cardboard boxes. I've done that. A garbage can turned upside down can be a plant cover. Here we can see that there is an old tablecloth of some sort. Now notice there's kind of a gap there. That's potentially where cold air can get up and under that cover. And notice how it's kind of almost wrapped like a lollipop. Rather than flaring out at the base, it kind of cinches down at the base. So it's not trapping a whole lot of heat. That particular plant is questionable as to how well it's being protected by this particular cover. And you can kind of see that gap now that I brought that animation up. See that there? Again, that cover needs to go up and over and all the way down to the base, ideally flaring it out a bit like a teepee. Now, people get creative. Maybe you have some old doors, maybe you have some old windows that you're getting rid of, or you can find cheap at a Salvation type store or salvage yard or something like that, and you can use a couple of old windows to make a protective covering like the left-hand picture. Or you can go to the home improvement center or similar places and get that kind of corrugated plexi, or what is that? I can't think of the material's name right now, but you know what that is. And you can bend it. It's so flexible, and with some stakes kind of make a tunnel to grow your early season vegetables or protect your flowers or something. Now, that's not going to keep the cold air from blowing through that, so you would have to cover the ends with some kind of board or blanket or something like that. Here you get the idea with my cute little PowerPoint animations, but something would have to seal up the end, however you figure that out. Cloches. Parlez-vous français, anyone? Cloche, bell. Originally, cloches were made out of glass. They're very pretty. Sometimes you'll see them at antique shops for outrageous sums of money, and I personally wouldn't buy any of them to use outside. Maybe I'd use it to cover my cheese board or something fancy schmancy instead. But cloches are everywhere nowadays. Our milk jugs and things like that essentially is a cloche. Cut the bottom off, and you can slide it over the top of that young seedling of some kind of dicot plant. You can tell it's a dicot, right? And what's great about the milk jug is that if you keep the cap is when it's cold, you put the cap on, and then you sink the edge down around the plant, and when it gets warmer during the day, but you know it's going to be cool the next several nights in a row, you just pull the lid off during the day to vent the heat out and snap it back down at night. It works quite well. Plus, because these are clear to semi-translucent, they allow enough light for plants to grow for quite a long period of time. Again, sometimes it can get a bit too hot for some plants, but generally if you can lift that lid off or unscrew the lid or pop it off, it'll vent pretty well. Now, I was in Hernando County many years ago, and I had a farmer come in, and he had planted about 5 or 6 acres of seedless watermelon. Now, seedless watermelon, each seed is worth about, back in the day, about $1. Seriously, they're very expensive, especially back then. They were fairly new, the seedless watermelon. And he had all these planted out there, and we were going to get a late season frost. This was about the middle of March. And I said to him, can you irrigate to protect them? We'll talk about that in a little bit later in this module. And he said no. In ag, using water for cold protection is the most widely used form of cold protection. So that was out. Now we have 5 or 6 acres to deal with. And I kind of thought, and I looked around, and I hemmed and hawed, and I said, do you have any frost cloth? Of course, does he have frost cloth? No, of course he doesn't have frost cloth ready to go. So what else? And I'm kind of looking around, and then I said to him, "Are you growing them in plastic with the mound? You know how they mound it up and the plastic sheeting is there, and they cut a hole in the plastic sheeting to start the plant. The plastic sheeting works as a mulch to keep the weeds down. You know what I'm talking about, trainees? I hope you do." And as I'm thinking about it, I spotted a styrofoam cup in my office. And he said, yes. And I said, would a styrofoam cup kind of fit right in there? And he looked at it and he said, probably just about perfectly. I said, I think you need to go to the club store down the road on Highway 50, the one that you need to be a member of, and get yourself a whole bunch of styrofoam cups and some teenagers to help you. As crazy as that sounds, folks, the guy went out to the club store. I think he bought every styrofoam coffee cup they had, and they covered them all because of the plastic, and it sat in there, kept it from blowing around. It protected his crop from the frost. I pat myself on the back for punting and figuring that one out on the fly. Again, be prepared for cold here is a take-home message as gardeners, especially if you're trying to get a jump start on some of our early season production. Cold frames, we don't see these too often, but a lot of us started things in cold frames further north to get a jump start on the cold. Uh, you can still do that here. Again, most of us won't do it, but again, what is old is still a good idea. Trunk wraps. We don't generally see this too often anymore because of the citrus industry and citrus greening. We see so few citrus trees. But trunk wraps have been used by grove owners and by homeowners for decades. Now, what a trunk wrap does is they slow the loss of heat, just like insulation does. They do not keep the trunk warm. Insulation doesn't keep it warm, it slows the heat loss. A good trunk wrap doesn't hold moisture because when it gets wet, it loses its R value, the resistance to the loss of heat. So something, and of course if it gets wet, that could cause rot to the trunk. Some things that have been used in the past are fiberglass. Well, fiberglass gets wet pretty easily, and you notice it has some kind of chicken wire around it to keep animals from chewing on it. I generally don't recommend fiberglass. Then you have this closed cell, which is the middle picture. This is kind of like what you wrap your hot water pipes with. And you can use that insulation for hot water pipes to do something very, very similar. In groves of yesteryear, I saw a lot of styrene. That's the generic for styrofoam, which is a registered trademark name of another company. But polystyrene has got some of the best R value. Also, it doesn't hold any moisture, so it works as a great trunk wrap. Now you're saying, well, gee, I'm not really protecting the tree here. The leaves are way above the protective zone of the wrap. So what good is this really doing? Very good for picking up on that. I'm impressed. Well, what you're protecting is where the graft meets the rootstock. So we're protecting the top portion, the desirable variety or cultivar of citrus. In this case, could be avocado for that matter, or some other cold sensitive fruit that's been grafted or budded. We're protecting the scion, the top part. Remember scion from plant propagation? So what would happen is if it gets so cold that the top is damaged in the spring, they would cut that back, and hopefully the scion, which is about 6 or so inches above the soil line, was protected by the trunk wrap. That's the idea behind a trunk wrap. Now, as crazy as it sounds, you can improvise a trunk wrap. My cousin, who used to live in Spring Hill, knew a cold snap was happening and had way too large of a citrus tree to protect with traditional covers, etc. And the trunk was so large that the wrap wouldn't fit anymore. So she went out with a couple of old with old towels and wrapped it around the trunk and used some duct tape or mailing tape to hold it in place. Sounds crazy, but it works, folks. Think outside the box. Occasionally, if you drive around in some young citrus grove areas, you will see soil banking Generally, we don't see this too often anymore, but occasionally I have seen it here in Dave City. What you do is several days, preferably a few days ahead of the cold, or better yet, early in the season, you mound up soil around the trunk. Now, the soil is going to absorb a lot of solar radiation and really radiate a lot of heat to the scion on a cold night. This offers some of the best cold protection of any method for citrus in large scale operations of a grove. Now, the problem is you can damage the roots. Also, because its soil gets moist from irrigation and rainfall, fire ants and diseases can be a problem. But this can be a great way to protect a young tree, citrus or other cold sensitive tree, in a pinch. If we know we're going to get a 1989 freeze event where we're warm right before the cold and all of a sudden cool down, you could mound that up several days ahead of time and protect your young fruit trees this way. Something to think about should that happen again, and it will. Wind machines. Okay, I know you don't have one of those in your backyard, but maybe you've driven around in some of the citrus groves. Especially, I saw a couple of these where I lived in Lake Wales many years ago. What they do is they move air around from the cold air settles downward. So it moves the warmer air down toward the ground level to protect the crop underneath. Now, of course, you need quite a few of these moving quite a bit of air, and there's no practical way to duplicate this in a home landscape. But the next time you should spot one of these in a grove, you can tell your friends and family what it does and why it's there. It's kind of more of a gee whiz, I know that and you don't bit of trivia. Grove heaters. I get asked about this from time to time. Grove heaters probably went out of favor back in the 1970s for lots of good reasons. First of all, they were a lot of work to employ them into a citrus grove. And each of those had to be filled with a fuel and usually had to be refilled during the night. And they usually filled it with the cheapest thing that'll burn. Usually a low grade of diesel was employed, although some people use kerosene. So these things put out a lot of soot, a lot of pollution, were very messy. They put out a lot of heat in a very small amount of area. So the citrus tree or whatever crop was being protected by a heater, one side of it would burn, part of the tree would be okay, and the other side of the tree would freeze. These don't prove to be very, very effective. But every so often you'll see these in antique shops and all that, and people want to set that out in the yard. A fire in the yard. You better be watching it all night long, folks. Let's talk about water in protecting plants. Well-watered landscapes, not overwatered landscapes, will survive cold better. Why is this? Moist soil absorbs more heat from sunlight and will release more heat at night. This ability to radiate additional heat may be as much as a couple of degrees Fahrenheit. Ideally, you should water a few days ahead of a cold event, of course during your watering restriction hours and days. So it may be more than a few days, but generally we have a good idea within our week ahead forecast nowadays as to whether we're going to have a cool down or a really some rough weather coming up. So watering ahead of time it will absorb more heat and hopefully protect your plants a little bit better. Inevitably, as a master gardener, you will hear on some early morning television program, news program, that they'll have a irritatingly perky morning reporter out in the strawberry fields of Plant City, and he'll be out there or she'll be out there and say, "Here we are in the strawberry fields of Plant City, and Farmer Brown's been out here all night icing his crop of strawberries, and the igloo of ice has protected his crop from this freeze. And how did it go, Farmer Brown?" or whatever his name is. And then the microphone goes underneath the nose of the farmer who's been up all night. and he'll say, well, thank you, Mr. Irritatingly Perky Morning Reporter. It's been good. It's been cold. Uh, it was a rough night, but we watched the sprinklers and they turned and they yeah we got ice and everything's fine. And then the microphone goes underneath the nose of the irritatingly perky morning reporter. Back to you in the studio. Now, inevitably, almost every perky morning reporter will tell you the igloo of ice has protected the crop, whether it's strawberries or citrus or whatever. No, the igloo of ice did nothing to protect the crop whatsoever. As you can see in this photograph, these citrus are entombed in ice, and that ice is not protecting those citrus whatsoever. Now you're thoroughly confused, right? Good. Just where I wanted you to be right now. Confused by this. Why do we do it if the igloo of ice isn't protecting the crop? That's because there's a science to this, boys and girls. Ice isn't the protection of plants. It is constantly freezing water that protects the plants. Why is this? As long as liquid water is being formed into solid water, it gives up heat. Some of you may have a chemistry or science background and know what that's called. It's called the heat of fusion. So as long as water is going from liquid to solid, heat is being given up, and the crop underneath that ice layer is getting just enough heat to keep it right above the freezing point. Just a bit above the freezing point, barely. It's very hard to protect plants with water because what happens? Sprinklers ice over, pumps go down. Think about how your irrigation system works around your home. Your irrigation system is designed to turn on zone 1, let's say, and that may be your front yard. And then it goes from zone 1 for half hour, whatever amount of time it needs, clicks off, and then goes to zone 2. And then it goes to zone 2 and it waters for 20 minutes or whatever, clicks off and goes to zone 3, and so on and so forth. When the water turns off in zone 1, you no longer have constantly freezing water. So what happens? The water starts to evaporate. That's called evaporative cooling. That's why we sweat. I didn't say this was always pretty, did I? We sweat. That cools us off. Well, now we're cooling the temperature underneath that ice below ambient air temperature. And think about our weather conditions on some of the coldest nights. The dew point is very, very low. Sometimes it's as low as the single digits. So that plant material is now being cooled closer to the dew point temperature. So if the ambient air temperature is 18 degrees, already cold night, but the dew point is 5 degrees, you probably, if the water turned off, are experiencing 5-degree temperature on your plant material. So keep this in mind with irrigating and using water to protect plants. It is not ice, it is constantly freezing water. So what's the best thing to do as a homeowner or as a master gardener helping county residents? The first thing I tell them to do on cold nights is go to the time clock. And here we can see in this particular picture the time clock. Look at the large white button in the middle. That's got a pie-shaped arrow, and you can see it's in the auto position. That should be switched over, whether you go clockwise or counterclockwise, it won't matter, but you need to switch it where that arrow is now pointing to off. You want to have your irrigation system completely off on nights where you're going to get even close to the freezing mark, because remember, evaporative cooling can happen on some of these cold nights. So even if it's 35 for an overnight low, but the dew point is, let's say, 20, the water comes on and turns off, it's going to cool that temperature down into potentially the 20s. So again, Keep this in mind. The best thing to do for most homeowners when it comes to irrigation on frosty nights is to turn off the system completely. Just as a side note, after a frost event, you might want to check your irrigation system to see if there's any damage to the pipes or sprinkler heads. But that's another story for another time. That concludes part 2 of cold protection. Join me in part 3 where we show some symptoms of cold damage on some of our plants.